About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
This is Noetic Moments, the show that explores what consciousness is, what it does, and how it works, and how our lives could be much fuller if we understood it better. I am Ruth Miller, a longtime student of consciousness, cybernetics, and culture, and through this series of programs, I'm introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research, and I'm explaining some of their ideas and experiments. I'll also explore some relevant news items and answer questions that you send to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org. And Noetic is spelled Noetic. Now, through these programs, over the last couple of years, we've learned that although the medical world defines consciousness as what we are aware of in the moment, most of what goes on in the mind is not in our awareness at all, but goes on in other aspects of consciousness. Besides our normal awareness, the conscious mind, there's what keeps our bodies going and includes our fears and beliefs about threats and dangers. We call this the subconscious mind. And then there's what connects us with our highest ideals and guides us in our actions, the superconscious mind. We've learned that we can change our state of consciousness, so we're aware of different aspects of mind at different times. And then we learned that brains modify whatever sensory signals they receive to fit past patterns of experience, following a default network or structure in the brain. This means that we perceive, we see, hear, taste, and feel what our brains expect to experience based on the past. We've learned that no one yet has been able to pinpoint how ideas and thoughts are formed in brain tissue, and we saw that our body often responds faster than nerve impulses or chemicals can travel, long before we're aware of it. Some experiments have even demonstrated that a person's mind continues to perceive and process for as much as several hours. Awareness continues even when the brain and heart are flatlined, and the person has been declared dead. Based on all this, many scientists have come to accept that what we call mind is not the product of the electrochemical activity of the cells making up the brain, but is, in fact, the activity of a field that surrounds and permeates the brain and the body. It's possible to measure at least a portion of this field as electromagnetic activity for several inches around the body, in what some say is an egg shape extending from below our knees to a few inches above our heads. Mind, then, is a field, a pattern of energy that exists whether the body is functioning or not, and permeates and develops with the body and the brain. This means that the brain is best understood as a receiver-transmitter, receiving messages from the mind and transmitting them to the body, and receiving messages from the organs and the senses and transmitting them to the body as the subconscious mind. Some researchers are exploring how the two hemispheres of our brain are involved in this transmitting and receiving, from the world primarily through the left hemisphere and interacting with our mind primarily through the right hemisphere. We've learned that this field of mind affects energy and matter in a variety of ways beyond the body. For example, when the subatomic building blocks of the universe show up as energy or matter in quantum physics experiments, depending on whether a mind is present to observe them. Or when people's bodies or their pets have been observed to change when someone they're connected with turns attention their way. Then there's the fact that individuals and the collective mind can change the readouts from random number generators, as on the network of computers run by the Global Consciousness Project. Now, Every field is a unique pattern of vibration that's different from other fields, and these fields can vibrate along similar patterns, resonating with each other and affecting each other across space and time. As a result, a growing number of scientists are seeing our individual mind as part of a larger field. Some are equating the mind with the quantum or zero-point field out of which all matter and energy arise. And some researchers are using the equations of quantum mechanics, relativity, and computer learning algorithms to describe the role of consciousness in the formation of matter. Together, these understandings help explain things like the law of attraction, how the world around us mirrors what our consciousness is focused on, how accessing information is possible through insight, intuition, and channeling, how dreams affect the body and the consciousness of ourselves and others, how music affects the brain and the body and connects us with other minds, how we can enhance or slow down our healing process through our thoughts, emotions, and visualizations, and how the belief in a treatment can help a patient experience healing in the placebo effect, how remote viewing and telekinesis work, and how we can get into a state of flow in which the mind and the brain are in sync, maximizing our effectiveness. Ultimately, how thoughts and emotions affect our overall well-being. You can catch up on the past shows explaining all this on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you'll also find links to the clips, books, and authors that I mentioned. And we are streaming on KXCR.net and on SoundCloud. Today we're going to look again at the relationship between the brain and mind from the point of view of a computer programmer who also teaches what he calls psychobiology. His name is Eric Zeidel.
How can brains, material stuff, be conscious?
Right. It's a question that I told myself I'll never try to answer, but now I realize I cannot avoid it because it is so dominant, pervasive, and really important. So I ask my class, I teach a class in Introduction to Psychobiology. An organism comes down from Mars. How do you decide if it's conscious or not? And I know what they're going to say, so I have the list already planned for the next handout, for the next slide. And they say adaptive problem solving. You want some unwired ability to solve a new problem in a new way. That's one thing. You want an organism to be able to do that, to adapt to the environment. So I say, a thermostat? So no, it has to be, the range has to be bigger and so on and so on. The second thing they say, how about emotions? It has to have emotions, feelings. Okay, let's program an amygdala or some kind of a priority system that says, I like this, I like that less, I don't like that, and let me prioritize my actions according to that. I can program that into a computer, not a problem. Then they say something about self-awareness. Okay, well, a computer can, I'm turning the problem now into showing that a computer can be made conscious if we are satisfying all these criteria. A representation of the environment, a representation of the self, and the self is part of the environment, and therefore you have some representation of self, with the past, the present, and the future. Okay, they're not so happy about that one because they say, but that's, you're programmed to do that. Well, evolution programmed me to do that, so I'm not sure it's different. And then we come to qualia, subjective experience. What is that? You know, the feeling I feel pain now, I see red now. I'm not sure what that is. So I think maybe that is just a metacognitive level of representation where we don't process information about the environment or about decisions, but about the decision. In other words, we are at a higher level that looks at the lower level and talks about it. It seems to me that's what that extra level of consciousness is. Let's assume that that's the case. Metacognitive, exactly. Above the cognitive, where we talk about the cognition as if we observe it from above. Not quite the theater view of Dennett, but something like that. Well, that means two things. First of all, that consciousness is continuous. We have more of it or less of it. Some of my colleagues have less of it than others, but certainly some animals have it less than others. So humans more than monkeys, monkeys more than dogs, dogs more than cats, and so on. And plants may have it too to some extent, in the adaptive behavior, for example.
All right, so this high-level programmer who is a student of and a professor of psychobiology is saying that consciousness, that is awareness, not all these other levels we've been talking about, awareness can be programmed into a computer. Programmed as self-awareness, programmed as planning and problem-solving, programmed as what he's calling qualia, the capacity to sense whether something is red or something is desirable. And he's saying that there is, in human awareness or in the awareness that we call consciousness, not only the actual perception, but the perception of the perception or considerations of what has been perceived. All of that is in the programming. And he's pointing out, and we'll talk more about this in other shows, that plants demonstrate most of these qualities of consciousness that he's been talking about. So the connections of neurons that are equivalent to the connections of the wiring in a computer are programmable and are programmed in the brain to do all the things that most materialist scientists think is what consciousness consists of, which is fascinating. The other thing that he's pointing out, too, is that that form of consciousness, these ways of being aware, is something that is continuous. That is, it's not that it's either on or off, but there are lesser and greater degrees of consciousness in every life form, which is an interesting way to look at it, and it totally fits what all the research is suggesting. But again, what he's talking about as consciousness is what we're talking about as awareness, only one of the three different aspects of consciousness that we experience as human beings. Now, he's going to go on now and talk about what happens when the left brain and the right brain are not communicating effectively. It's fascinating.
Disorders of consciousness should involve some dissociation between what you do and what you know about what you do. And we have examples like that many times in clinical neuropsychology. The split brain is the most obvious example, where the two sides work in parallel, both are conscious, both act in purposeful, intentional manner, and yet they don't necessarily agree. So you ask a patient, a split brain patient is talking to me, he's smoking. I say to him, what about your left hand? He says, what about it? Do you ever use it? Of course, the left hand is controlled by his right hemisphere, and he's talking to me with his left hemisphere. He says, no, it's kind of useless. I say, what is it doing now? He looks and he's seeing that he's holding the cigarette in it. I guess it's useful for something. So he was using that information, but not conscious of the fact that he was using it. So it was useful, but not available to his consciousness. We have patients with neglect who can do some things, but don't know that they can do it. They can perceive things in the left visual half field, but they're not conscious that they are perceiving it. So you show them two houses, one with flames, one without flames. You say, do you see the same picture? Yes. Are they different? No, they're identical. Where would you rather live? And they point to the one without the flames. So they don't know why. And they don't know why. So part of the brain is processing the information, making a preference, and yet that information is not available to consciousness in the sense that it's not verbally reported. So when we say consciousness, we should ask, how do we probe it? If we probe it in terms of purposeful behavior, it may be there, even though it's not available to verbal consciousness. And I'm convinced now that consciousness doesn't require language. Why? Because I'm convinced that the right hemisphere has it.
So his idea of consciousness clearly is awareness, and up to the point where he realizes that the right brain is fully aware but cannot be verbalized, he's suggesting that awareness is something that you can talk about, but he gets it, that the right brain does not necessarily verbalize, but is totally aware. Fascinating stuff, and he is helping people a lot with this work who are dealing with issues of the brain and the programming in the brain. Well, if you just tuned in, you are listening to Noetic Moment, a radio show exploring what consciousness is, how it works, and how our lives can be greatly enhanced as we understand it more fully. I'm Ruth Miller, your host, and that sound tells me it's time to look at a book, answer any questions you email to ruth@noeticmoments.org, and maybe take a look at what's going on in the news that can help us understand the role our state of consciousness plays in our experience. I thought today I would share some of the research that's been being published in the last few weeks that has to do with that inner narrative, that capacity to verbalize what's going on, how it affects our awareness, how it affects our capacity to think and to remember. There are a number of studies coming out in the various neuroscience journals that are looking at the role of that voice in our head that is constantly going, that chatter, the inner narrative, the internal narrative by some people's language. Almost all of us have that going on, so don't feel badly about it if you do. Very, very few people don't have it, and some of the new studies are looking at those people who, frankly, are not hearing someone telling them, oh, you did that right. Oops, you got that one wrong. Oh, do you remember such and so? Oh, don't forget this. You know that voice. You've got it too. So there are a few people that don't have it, and some scientists have been studying them and finding that they don't remember things as well as people who have this voice. When I read that study, I realized, I use that inner narrative to help me remember. And I imagine if you pay attention to your inner verbalizations, you'll be aware of that too, that you repeat some things and as reminders, or you tell yourself, well, when I'm doing this, I'll do that. And as you tell yourself that, then sometimes you actually do, right? The other thing that the internal narrative apparently does is facilitate people's awareness of where they are in a process. If you cook, for example, you may be reciting the recipe in your head as you are doing various things, whether it's keeping something at a simmer or whether it's adding just this amount of that spice or whatever. A lot of us do repeat the instructions while we're doing it. Sometimes I think that's because that's how we were taught to cook by our parents or whoever it was who taught us. And so we're replaying their voice in our head. Another thing that the internal narrative apparently does is it helps us to order our experiences so that we're able to sequence various things that have happened in some kind of linear verbal list. And that's where the left frontal cortex, of course, is helping us to reprogram the brain, actually. Another part of the study had to do with rhyming and the ability to see rhymes and comprehend them and carry forward. Not having an inner narrative affected comprehension of rhymes and to carry them further into their conversation or other activities. In related news, giving artificial intelligence systems an inner monologue makes them better at reasoning. They have a new method that trains AI systems to think before they respond to prompts. And this is very different from, say, ChatGPT or those other things. This new system, it's called Quiet Star, generates many inner rationales in parallel before responding to a conversational prompt. When the AI answers the prompts, it generates a mixture of predictions with and without a rationale and prints the best answer. And the Quiet Star trained version of one of them scored over 30% in a reasoning test compared to 10 in almost all the others. So an inner narrative helps AI to be far more effective. That's fascinating, isn't it? It really does suggest that the way the brain works is very much the way a computer works, which fits what cyberneticians have been saying for a very long time and also fits what most material scientists continue to say because they think consciousness comes from the brain. What all these studies have in common is the idea that the inner narrative affects the way the brain is computing and is responding to the environment around it. And it means the inner narrative actually affects the brain's activities, which leads to some interesting implications. It means we can program the brain, which is precisely what people like Joe Dispenza and other people who are helping people shift how their brains are wired, shift that programming so that the awareness is in the direction that provides their sense of a better life, is doing. They're changing the inner narrative to focus on what it is that they truly wish to have in their life. If you haven't tried it, you might take a look at some of the YouTubes out there, and we've talked about a few of them, that give you meditations or combinations of negations and affirmations or visualizations that are literally editing the inner narrative to rewire the brain. So the brain is, in fact, a computer, but the mind is so much more, as we have been seeing as we've gone through this program. The mind, this field of consciousness that includes so much more than what our inner narrative ever tells us, that includes that nonverbal right brain stuff that Zadil was talking about earlier, and that includes the capacity to tap into the broader field of wisdom, knowledge, understanding, and experience that we all share. The one mind of across humanity that Ralph Waldo Emerson talked about way back when, over 150 years ago. Well, that's it for today's show. We are out of time today, but remember, you can continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where there are links to archived past shows, along with titles and other resources we refer to on the show, and where you can send me your comments and questions, which I'll do my best to get answered the next time we're on the air. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments, recorded in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon. And have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic Sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.